Welcome. Let your shoulders fall away from your ears, and let your breath find its own slow rhythm. There is nowhere to be tonight, but here, drifting backward through centuries toward a quiet island nation. We will walk together through gardens older than most nations, and rest among stones that have not moved in 1,000 years. Just listen, and let the past carry you. Japan's landscape is mostly mountain. Steep slopes cover most of the 4 main islands, leaving narrow valleys and river plains for people to settle. Early inhabitants built their lives around sudden changes in elevation, cold, rushing streams, and forests that pressed close to every village. That constant nearness of stone, water, and wood shaped how later generations would arrange a garden. The land itself taught the first lessons. Circles of standing stones appear at sites from the Jomon period, arranged with evident care. Some rings stretch wide across open ground, built by hunter-gatherer communities thousands of years before writing reached the islands. Archaeologists have found the stones set upright, deliberately spaced, facing directions that still puzzle researchers today. No inscriptions explain their purpose. Whatever their use, they suggest people already found meaning in the placement of rock. By the Yayoi period, rice farming had reached the islands from the continent. Farmers dug channels to guide river water into flooded paddies, shaping the land into terraces and grids. Villages grew beside these managed waterways, their wooden houses raised on posts above the damp ground. Water no longer simply flowed, it was directed, held, and released on purpose. That habit of channeling water would echo for centuries after. Long before shrines had names, the Japanese believed spirits called kami lived within the land itself. A waterfall might hold one. So might an old cedar, or a boulder split by frost. These spirits were not carved or painted. They simply resided in things already there. Worship meant approaching the object with care, not building something new around it. Shinto's earliest shrines were not buildings at all. A shrine might be nothing more than a grove of trees set apart from the surrounding forest by a low fence of undressed wood. Villagers left offerings at its edge rather than walking inside. The sacred was marked by boundary alone, not by roof or wall. This distinction between marked space and built space would shape Japanese garden thinking for generations. In some villages, a single boulder served as the whole of the shrine. No roof covered it, no doorway framed it. People simply gathered near the stone, faced it, and offered rice or salt at its base. The rock needed nothing added to make it holy. Its size and stillness were enough. Passers-by lowered their voices as they walked near it, even without being told to. Ropes of twisted rice straw, called shimenawa, were hung across certain trees and rocks to mark them as dwellings of kami. White paper strips, folded in careful zigzags, hung from the rope and stirred in passing wind. The rope told villagers without a single word that this was no ordinary tree. Some of these markings were renewed every year, the straw replaced fresh each season by hands that had done it before. Japan's earliest written chronicles, compiled in the 7th and 8th centuries, describe the islands themselves as the work of divine beings. According to these records, God stirred the sea with a jeweled spear, and the drops that fell formed land. The islands were not just inhabited by spirits, they were described as born from them. Such stories placed garden, like imagery of water, land, and creation together, at the very start of the written record. The chronicle called the Nihon Shoki, finished in the year 720, preserves the oldest known references to gardens on the islands. Compiled by court scholars working from older records and oral accounts, it mentions ponds and islands built for emperors long before that. Much of what it describes cannot be checked against any surviving physical trace. Still, its brief lines remain the earliest written proof that garden making, in some form, had already begun in Japan. Let the breath lead for a while. Take one in slowly, and let it leave you even slower, like a tide going out further than it came in. Feel the air soften as it leaves your throat, your chest, your fingertips. There is no rhythm to keep, only the one your body already knows. Let each exhale carry a little more of the day out with it until the room around you feels far away. The Soga clan, one of the most powerful families of the Asuka period, built a residence with a pond and a small island at its center. Records describe the estate as unusually grand for its time. Soga no Umiko, the clan's leader, became so associated with his island garden that court writers began calling him the minister of the island. Water was drawn in to fill the pond. Stones were set along its edge to hold the shape of a shore. A word for garden pond, shima, first survives in court writings from this same era. Its older meaning was simply island, the raised ground rising from water. Scribes used it to describe both the actual islands of the sea and the small stone islands built inside noble ponds. The overlap was not an accident of language. To build an island in a pond was, in some sense, to hold the sea itself inside a walled garden. Empress Suiko's court, ruling in the early 7th century, welcomed landscape ideas arriving from China by way of Korea. Buddhist teachers and craftsmen brought drawings and descriptions of continental gardens built for emperors far across the sea. Ponds shaped like calligraphy strokes and islands set at careful angles became fashionable among the aristocracy. Suiko's officials studied these foreign models closely. Slowly, garden design in Japan began absorbing shapes it had never used before. Centuries after the Soga clan's garden fell into ruin, archaeologists working near Nara uncovered arranged stones beneath layers of soil. The stones lay in patterns too deliberate to be natural, edges smoothed, and set at angles that matched old written descriptions. Excavation records from the site noted careful documentation of each stone's position. The find offered rare physical proof that the pond gardens described in old chronicles had truly once existed on that ground. Nara became the imperial capital in the year 710, and garden building followed the court to its new home. The city was laid out on a grid modeled after a great Chinese capital. Noble households arriving from Asuka brought their taste for ponds and islands with them. New gardens rose beside new mansions almost as quickly as the walls themselves. The move gave garden design a wider stage than it had ever had before. Io Palace's grounds included a winding artificial stream, its curves cut deliberately rather than left to chance. Excavations of the palace's eastern garden later revealed a channel that bent gently through a walled enclosure, lined with smooth river stones. Water was drawn from nearby springs and guided along the winding path before draining away. The curve of the stream mattered as much as its water. A straight channel, it seems, was never what its builders wanted. Courtiers gathered beside garden water for poetry contests, a custom borrowed from Chinese court life. Cups of wine floated down winding streams, while guests composed verses before the cup reached them. Failing to finish in time carried a small social cost, though the exact penalties were rarely written down. Robes trailed along mossy banks as poets leaned toward the water. The stream itself became part of the game, setting the pace no one could argue with. The Manyoshu, a great collection of poems gathered in the 8th century, preserves images of Nara's gardens that no ruin could keep intact. Its verses describe plum blossoms, leaning over still ponds, and reflections trembling in evening wind. Some poets wrote of gardens they had walked themselves. Others imagined ones they had only heard described. The collection outlived the gardens it named. Its lines remain the clearest window left into how those grounds once looked and felt. Buddhist temples built in Nara imported garden layouts directly from Tang China, following plans carried home by monks and envoys. Pond shapes, bridge placements, and the spacing of trees followed continental templates almost exactly at first. Temple grounds were meant to feel orderly, mirroring the balance monks sought in meditation. Over time, small local adjustments crept into the design. A garden built to copy a foreign capital slowly began, in quiet ways, to look like nowhere but Japan. Tadaiji Temple's grounds, raised in Nara to house a great bronze Buddha, set patterns that outlasted the building itself. Its layout placed ponds, groves, and walking paths around the main hall in careful proportion. Monks moving between prayer halls past water and trees arranged to calm the mind before ceremony. Later temple builders across the country returned to this plan. A single Nara courtyard taught centuries of gardeners where a pond belonged. Feel the weight settle now, starting at your feet. They grow heavy against the sheets, no longer needing to hold you up. That heaviness climbs into your calves, then your knees, each one sinking a little deeper into the mattress. Let your hips follow, then your back, pressed low and still. There is nowhere for that weight to go, but down, and down is where it wants to be. The capital moved from Nara to a new city called Heian-kyo, later known by another name, Kyoto. Planners laid its streets in a wide grid, echoing the older capital but larger and more permanent. Emperors, nobles, and their households settled into a city meant to last for generations. It did, remaining the seat of imperial life for centuries afterward. Gardens grew alongside the new mansions, almost as soon as the foundations were dry. Shinden-style mansions built for Heian nobles faced south, opening onto a pond that mirrored the sky. The main hall stood at the north, with covered walkways stretching toward garden pavilions on either side. Guests entered along these covered paths rather than through the garden itself. The pond, placed for view rather than passage, framed nearly everything a household did outdoors. Facing south was no accident. It caught the sun and the water together. Aristocrats boarded pleasure boats shaped like dragons and phoenixes to drift across their garden ponds. Carved heads rose from the bows, painted in fading reds and golds that caught the evening light. Musicians sometimes rode along, their instruments carried carefully across gangplanks laid over the water. These boats were kept for festivals and private outings alike. A garden pond, it turned out, was wide enough to hold an entire small world afloat. Heian nobles composed poems while drifting across their garden ponds, verses often written on the spot and read aloud to companions. Boats moved slowly enough for a line of poetry to form before the next view arrived. A poem about mist over the water might be finished before the mist itself had cleared. Paper and ink were kept close at hand for exactly this purpose. Composing quickly, under gentle pressure, was considered part of the pleasure. The Tale of Genji, written by the court lady Murasaki Shikibu, describes garden scenes in loving, exact detail. Its chapters linger on wisteria, trailing over fences, autumn leaves scattered across stepping stones, and ponds lit by lanterns during evening gatherings. Readers of the novel could follow a character through an entire garden without ever leaving the page. The book's descriptions later helped historians imagine what Heian gardens actually looked like. Fiction, in this case, preserved what stone and wood did not. Water reaching aristocratic garden ponds was channeled down from nearby hills, carried through carved wooden troughs and shallow ditches. Estate workers maintained these channels constantly, clearing leaves and silt so the flow stayed steady through the seasons. A pond that ran dry embarrassed its owner more than any untended flower bed. Engineers of the period understood gravity well enough to move water gently across long distances. The hills above the city, in a quiet way, fed every garden below. The Sakutiki, written sometime in the 11th century, became the oldest surviving text on the making of gardens. Its author, believed to be a nobleman connected to the Heian court, wrote instructions on placing stones, shaping ponds, and planting trees for effect. No printing press existed then. The work spread slowly through hand-copied pages passed among garden-minded households. It treated garden design as a discipline worth writing down at all, which was itself unusual for its time. Few crafts of that era left instructions this detailed. No original copy of the Sakutiki has ever been found. What survives are later copies, made by hand across the centuries that followed its first writing. Some of these copies differ slightly from one another, with lines added or reordered by scribes who came after. Scholars have compared the surviving versions to reconstruct what the earliest text likely said. The book that shaped Japanese gardens for 1,000 years exists today only through the patience of anonymous copyists. Sakutiki tells gardeners to listen to the request of the stone. The text advises setting each rock according to the lean it already seems to favor, as though continuing a shape the land began on its own. A gardener who forced a boulder against its natural angle, the manual warned, left behind a corner that troubled every visitor who passed it. The land had preferences. Placement, in this view, was less invention than careful listening. Pure Land Buddhism imagined paradise as a garden of ponds. Followers believed the Buddha Amida presided over a Western realm filled with lotus blossoms, jeweled trees, and still water reflecting golden light. Temple builders in the capital tried to echo that paradise on earth, laying out ponds meant to resemble the ones described in Scripture. A worshipper standing before such water was meant to glimpse, briefly, what waited beyond this life. Belief shaped the shoreline as much as any engineer did. Somewhere beyond this room, a low hum rises and fades, the way old houses settle once the day has gone still. It might be wind moving through eaves, or a pipe cooling after warmth, or nothing you could ever name for certain. Let it come, and let it pass without following it. Your shoulders can loosen a little more each time it fades. There is only this room, this breath, and the sound leaving again. Byodoin's Phoenix Hall mirrors itself in still water. Built south of the capital as a nobleman's retreat before becoming a temple, its wooden wings spread outward like a bird settling onto the pond before it. On calm mornings, the reflection doubled the building so precisely that visitors could barely tell roofline from ripple. 2 golden phoenix ornaments crowned its roof, catching whatever light the season offered. The hall was built to be seen twice, once in wood and once in water. Kyoto-style pond gardens spread to temples across the provinces. Priests who had studied in the capital carried the design outward, teaching local builders how to shape ponds meant to suggest Amida's paradise. Provincial temples, smaller and poorer than those in Kyoto, adapted the pattern with whatever stone and water their land allowed. A pond a few paces wide could still gesture toward the same promised shore. The idea traveled farther than the wealth needed to build it grandly. Warfare in the 12th century disrupted aristocratic garden life. Rival clans fought for control of the court, and estates that had once hosted boating parties and poetry gatherings fell silent as owners fled or lost their standing. Ponds went untended. Reeds crept over stepping stones once swept daily by household staff. Gardens built for leisure found themselves, for a time, simply abandoned to weather and weeds. The wisteria kept blooming with no one left to admire it. Kamakura shoguns moved the center of power east. A new military government rose in the coastal town of Kamakura, far from the palaces and poetry circles of the old capital. Warriors who governed there had little patience for the elaborate boating gardens favored by court nobles. Their halls were plainer, their grounds smaller, shaped more for discipline than display. Power had shifted east, and garden fashion would eventually follow it. Buddhist monks crossed from China, carrying Zen teaching and garden ideas together. They arrived at coastal ports with little more than robes, scripture, and memories of the temple grounds they had studied within. Zen practice valued stillness and direct experience over elaborate ritual, and the monks who taught it also shaped the spaces where students would sit. A tradition of meditation brought with it, almost as a companion, a new sense of what a garden should feel like. Temples built for Zen practice favored smaller, quieter spaces. Where earlier gardens had spread across acres with boats and winding shorelines, Zen grounds often fit within a single-walled courtyard. A handful of stones, a stretch of moss, a few carefully placed trees could hold a monk's attention as well as any grand pond once had. Less water meant more stillness to notice. The garden shrank, and somehow it seemed to say more. Muso Soseki designed gardens meant for walking meditation. A Zen monk trusted by shoguns of his day, he laid out paths that led visitors past rocks and water in a sequence meant to calm the mind step by step. Each turn revealed a new arrangement, never all at once. Soseki believed a garden could teach the same lessons as sitting meditation, only through the feet instead of stillness. Walking, in his design, became its own kind of practice. Saihoji Temple became known for its moss. Over centuries, more than 100 varieties spread across the ground beneath its trees, unplanted and unplanned, until the whole floor turned the color of deep green velvet. Monks who tended the grounds learned to work around the moss rather than through it, sweeping fallen leaves by hand so the surface stayed unbroken. Visitors later gave the temple a second name, calling it simply the Moss Temple. No one had set out to grow it. The moss had simply arrived and stayed. Tenryuji's garden borrowed the mountain behind it as scenery. Its designer arranged a pond and a cluster of stones, so that the wooded slope beyond the temple wall seemed to belong to the garden itself, though no wall separated them. This technique, borrowing distant scenery, let a modest plot of ground feel as vast as the hills surrounding it. The mountain never changed, only the frame around it did. Sesshu, a Zen monk trained in painting, also designed garden landscapes. He had studied ink painting in China, learning to suggest mountains and rivers with a few practiced strokes, and he carried that same economy into stone and gravel. Temples in the western provinces credit him with gardens built on principles borrowed from his own paintings, each rock placed like a brushstroke on a blank scroll. His paintings survive in ink, his gardens survive in stone, weathered but still holding their shape. Let warmth begin somewhere small, at the center of your chest, and let it spread outward the way morning light moves across a floor. Feel it reach your shoulders first, loosening what they have carried all day. Then, let it drift down through your arms, into your hands, until your fingers feel heavy and warm and still. It continues down through your middle, unhurried, filling you the way water fills a low basin. Let it reach your legs now, your feet, until the whole length of you rests warm and full and settled, ready for sleep. Temple ledgers recorded garden repair costs after fire. Surviving account books from several Kyoto temples list payments for new stones, replacement trees, and laborers hired to clear scorched ground following blazes that swept through wooden halls. One such ledger notes the price paid for hauling fresh gravel to resurface a courtyard burned in an attack during the warring years. The garden had to be rebuilt from these plain figures, stone by stone, cost by cost, long after the flames themselves were forgotten. Ashikaga shoguns built retreats that later became temples after their deaths. A shogun would commission a villa for his own retirement, filling its grounds with ponds and pavilions suited to leisure rather than worship. Upon his death, the family often converted the estate into a Zen temple in his memory, its halls repurposed for prayer instead of parties. The garden usually stayed much as it had been, only its purpose changed. Tinkaku, the golden pavilion, rose beside its reflecting pond. Its upper floors were covered in gold leaf, catching the last light of afternoon and scattering it across the still water below. The building had begun as a retirement villa before becoming a temple, its garden arranged so that visitors approaching by the pond's edge would see the whole structure doubled in reflection. Even on overcast days, the pavilion seemed to hold its own light. Kinkaku, the silver pavilion, was never covered in silver at all. Plans for silver leaf, similar to the gold of its predecessor, were apparently abandoned, leaving the wooden structure to weather naturally into soft gray tones. Its garden includes a mound of raked sand, said to resemble Mount Fuji, standing beside a pond edged with worn stone. The name stayed silver, even after the silver itself was given up. Dry gardens used raked gravel to suggest flowing water. Zen temples built entire courtyards without a single pond, laying down white gravel combed into long parallel lines meant to read as ripples or currents. A boulder rising from the gravel could stand for an island, or a mountain breaking through mist. Monks maintained these patterns by hand, drawing the rake through the stone each morning as part of their practice. Water was implied, never poured. Ryoanji's rock garden holds 15 stones set in raked gravel. The stones are arranged in small clusters across a rectangle of white gravel, bordered by a low earthen wall and viewed from a wooden veranda rather than walked among. No plants, no water, and almost no color break the composition beyond moss clinging faintly to a few stone bases. Visitors have studied its arrangement for centuries, and no two describe it quite the same way. No record names the designer of Ryoanji's garden. The temple's own histories are quiet on the point, listing dates of construction, but never a name for the arrangement of stones. Later writers have offered guesses, attaching the composition to famous garden makers of the age. None of the claims can be proven. The stones themselves keep no signature, only their placement across white gravel. Visitors to Ryoanji often try counting its stones from the wooden veranda. No seat shows all of them. From most positions, one stone always seems to hide behind another, however the eye shifts. Guides have long noted the puzzle, though none explain it. Some visitors return again, chasing that missing view, leaving with only gravel and old wood underfoot to remember. Each morning, before the first visitors arrive, monks rake fresh lines into the gravel. Wooden rakes with wide teeth pull the stone into long parallel furrows, restoring patterns worn by wind and rain overnight. The work is done in near silence, one monk moving across the courtyard in slow passes. By the time gates open, every ripple looks untouched by human hands. Nothing stays raked for long. The pattern will return again at the next dawn. Aresensui gardens are best viewed seated, not walked through. Unlike the strolling ponds of earlier centuries, these dry compositions were built for a single fixed vantage, usually a temple veranda facing south. Visitors were expected to sit, breathe, and let the eye travel across gravel and stone without moving the body. Movement, in this design, happens only in the mind. The garden asks for stillness, not steps. Somewhere in this room, imagine a single candle, its flame settling lower with every breath you take. Let it burn low. The light does not need watching to fade. It will dim on its own, the way wax gives in to gravity without complaint. Let your shoulders drop the same way, unhurried, without needing permission. Whatever waited for you today can wait a while longer by the door. The ember will hold its small glow long after you've drifted past it into sleep. Stone arrangements suggest islands, waterfalls, and distant shores. A cluster of low rocks might stand for a group of small islands scattered across open water. A tall, angled stone can suggest a waterfall frozen mid-fall, its motion implied rather than shown. Elsewhere, a flat stone laid low might suggest a beach or a shoreline pulled back by low tide. Nothing here is only rock. Each shape carries the memory of somewhere else. Gardeners choose stones for shape rather than size alone. A small stone with the right curve might outweigh, in value, a boulder twice its size. Some stones were prized for a single flat face, others for the way moss had already begun to soften one edge. Weight mattered less than character. A stonemaker's eye looked for personality before mass. A single stone can take days to place correctly. Workers turned a boulder again and again before settling on an angle that suited its neighbors. Few tools existed for such work. Ropes, wooden levers, and long patience did most of it long before machinery arrived. A stone set even slightly wrong could unbalance an entire composition, so once satisfied, gardeners rarely touched it again. Tea ceremony began to shape a new kind of garden path. As the ritual of preparing and drinking tea grew more formal, hosts built small paths leading guests from the outside world toward a simple tea house. These paths were narrow, deliberately rough underfoot, meant to slow the visitor's pace. Stepping stones replaced open lawns. The walk itself became part of the ceremony, not just the approach to it. Sen no Rikyu shaped the aesthetic of a humble tea garden. Working in the service of powerful patrons, he favored plain materials over ornament, choosing rough stone and unpolished wood where others might have chosen gold. His gardens were built to quiet the mind before tea was ever served. Every element, however small, was considered part of that preparation. Nothing was left merely decorative. Stepping stones guide guests toward a tea house, spaced unevenly by design. Some sit close together, others require a small stretch of the leg, breaking any easy rhythm. Hosts placed them with care, testing the walk themselves before guests arrived. The path bends where a straight line would have been simpler. Speed was never the point of that walk. A stone water basin lets guests wash hands before tea. Carved low to the ground, it holds rainwater fed by a thin bamboo pipe that drips without pause. Guests knelt or bent to reach it, rinsing fingers and rinsing the mouth before stepping further along the path. The basin's surface wore smooth from generations of hands. Even the ladle rested at an angle chosen long before. Low gates force guests to bend as they enter the tea garden. Built no taller than a stooping man, the gate required lords and servants alike to lower their heads. Rank meant nothing at that threshold. Some gates were roofed with bark, others left bare to the weather. The bending itself was the lesson, repeated at every visit. Stone lanterns light the tea garden path at dusk. Carved from granite and set at turns in the walk, they held a small oil flame, or, later, a candle behind paper. Their light was never bright, only enough to find the next stone underfoot. Moss gathered on their caps within a few seasons. A lantern placed poorly could ruin an otherwise careful path. Fallen leaves are sometimes left unswept to look natural. A caretaker might rake most of the ground clear, then scatter a few leaves back by hand along the path's edge. The aim was not disorder itself, but the appearance of a garden untouched by anyone's hand at all. Guests were meant to feel they had wandered into a forest, not a design. Even carelessness in that garden was rehearsed. Let your jaw loosen now, just slightly, as though a small weight has lifted from beneath your chin. The muscles around your eyes need not hold anything either. Let them rest the way a held breath finally lets go. Behind your closed eyes, there is only a kind of dim, warm, dark, no shapes asking to be seen. Let your whole face grow heavy and still, as if it has finally set down something it has carried all day. There is no expression required of you now, none at all. The roji, or dewy path, separates the world outside from tea. Its very name suggests moisture, freshness, ground recently touched by rain even on dry days. Passing along it, a guest was meant to leave behind rank, business, and hurry, arriving at the tea house as a plainer version of themselves. Hosts sometimes sprinkled water on the stones before guests arrived, whether or not rain had fallen. The path did the work of forgetting for them. Toyotomi Hideyoshi commissioned gardens on a grand scale. Rising from modest birth to command armies and provinces, he brought the same appetite for spectacle into garden building that he brought to castles and campaigns. Craftsmen were summoned from distant provinces, and stones once prized in smaller gardens were hauled for miles to satisfy his taste. Where earlier patrons sought restraint, Hideyoshi sought abundance. His gardens announced power as plainly as any banner. Sanboin Temple's garden reflects Hideyoshi's taste for spectacle. Built late in his life near the old capital, it crowded together hundreds of stones gathered from far-flung estates, some prized enough to have names of their own. Ponds were shaped with island after island, bridges crossing in quick succession. Where a Zen garden might rest the eye on a handful of stones, this one filled it. The result still draws visitors who come simply to count what was gathered there. Peace under the Tokugawa shoguns allowed garden building to spread. With warfare largely ended, and provincial lords required to maintain residences in the new capital of Edo, garden making became a settled art rather than a rushed luxury. Skilled workers passed techniques to sons and apprentices without the old urgency of war interrupting the work. Budgets grew steadier, seasons became reliable again. Gardens built in those years were meant to last generations, not merely to impress a single visit. Provincial lords, called daimyo, began building strolling gardens around their castle towns. Required to maintain grand residences under Tokugawa rule, they poured resources into grounds, meant for walking, not merely viewing from a veranda. Paths wound past ponds, hills, and borrowed groves, each turn planned to surprise. These gardens announced a lord standing to visiting officials and rival clans alike. Many still bear the names of the families who built them. Korakuen opened in the castle town of Okayama as a lord's private retreat. Finished in the late 1600s, it stretched across flat ground beside a river, unusual for a garden of its size. Wide lawns opened between ponds and groves, offering long views rare in hillier gardens elsewhere. The lord and his household used it for entertaining guests and watching seasonal change from raised pavilions. Rice fields were even kept within its walls, a quiet nod to the land beyond. Kenroku-en in Kanazawa grew slowly across generations of the ruling Maeda family. No single lord finished it, each added ponds, hills, or tea-houses to what earlier generations had begun. Water was carried in from a distant river through a channel, built specifically to feed its fountains and streams. Over roughly a century and a half, additions layered atop additions until paths overlapped decades of separate plans. The garden reads today as a kind of family diary, written in stone and water. Rikujin, built in Edo, recreated scenes drawn from classical poetry collections. Its designer, a senior official under the shogunate, laid out paths meant to evoke 88 specific views described in old verse. Visitors strolling its ponds and hills were meant to recognize lines they had studied since childhood, made suddenly physical underfoot. Hills were shaped and named after poetic places far from Edo itself. Walking the garden became a kind of literary pilgrimage without leaving the city. Strolling gardens were designed to reveal a new view at each turn of the path. Unlike a garden meant to be seen whole from one seat, these unfolded scene by scene as a visitor walked. A pond might vanish behind a hill only to reappear from a different angle, transformed by distance and light. Designers placed trees and rocks to frame each reveal precisely, timing the visitor's steps like a piece of music. No two walks through the same garden felt quite identical. Sometimes a fine view was deliberately hidden until the path finally revealed it. Hedges, fences, or a rise of ground blocked what lay just beyond, denying the eye any shortcut. Only after rounding a final bend did the pond, bridge, or distant hill open into full sight. Garden makers called this technique a kind of concealment meant to heighten arrival. The wait, brief as it was, made the view feel earned rather than simply given. Notice for a moment how the exhale takes longer than the inhale, if you let it. There is no need to force this, it happens on its own, the way water finds the lowest point in a garden without being told. Let each breath out stretch a little further than the one before, unhurried, without counting. The shoulders lower on their own when this is allowed to happen. Somewhere in the chest, a held place opens, the way a fist opens when nothing more needs holding. Let the next breath be even longer than this one, and the one after that longer still, until breathing itself becomes the only sound left. Old maps sometimes show gardens far larger than they appear today. Surveys drawn for feudal lords recorded boundaries that later shrank as cities grew around them. Roads widened, and estates were divided among heirs. A garden once bordered by rice paddies might now sit hemmed by streets on every side. Comparing an Edo period map to a modern one, historians have traced entire ponds and groves that vanished generations ago, leaving only their names in old records. Katsura Imperial Villa rose beside the slow-moving Katsura River, southwest of Kyoto. Built in the early 1600s for a member of the imperial family, it combined garden, tea house, and residence into a single unbroken composition. The river itself supplied water to the ponds within, linking the estate to the wider landscape rather than sealing it off. Bridges, islands, and stepping stones were arranged with an attention historians still study for its refinement. Few gardens from that century survive so completely intact. Tatsura's garden was arranged to be seen from a boat drifting slowly across its ponds. Guests once floated along planned routes, watching stone lanterns, bridges, and tea houses pass in a deliberate sequence, much as a scroll painting unrolls scene by scene. Viewed from land, the same features could look ordinary, even plain. Only from the water did their spacing and proportion reveal themselves as intended. The garden, in a sense, was built for a passenger rather than a walker. Shugakuin Imperial Villa, northeast of Kyoto, borrows an entire valley for its view. Built in the mid-1600s for a retired emperor, its upper garden opens onto rice paddies, wooded hills, and distant peaks beyond the estate's own boundary. No wall closes it off. The borrowed scenery completes the composition, folding farmland into the design as though planted there on purpose. Visitors climbing to the highest pavilion see the whole countryside gathered into a single, framed horizon. By the 1700s, gardeners across Japan were writing down what once passed only by hand and eye. Printed manuals described how to bend a pine branch without breaking it, how to time pruning to a tree's own rhythm, how to read a stone's grain before cutting it. These illustrated books let techniques travel between provinces once separated by mountain roads. Copies survive still, their pages soft with handling. Temple libraries kept them long after the gardeners who wrote them had died. Niwashi, the professional gardeners of Japan, organized themselves into guilds that passed skill from father to son. An apprentice might spend years only raking gravel before touching a stone or shaping a branch. Knowledge moved through the hands more than through instruction. It settled into habit, watched and repeated. Guild membership marked a family's standing within a temple or estate for generations, and some gardening lines can still be traced through old parish and temple records. Pines in these gardens were shaped for decades to look as if wind alone had bent them. A gardener might wire a single branch downward for years, adjusting the angle each season until the tree settled into its new form. The final shape often mimicked coastal pines battered by sea gales, though the garden itself sat far inland. Such training could outlast the gardener who began it. A pine might pass through 3 sets of hands before it reached its intended form. Cloud pruning shaped certain trees into rounded, floating masses of foliage, layered like drifting clouds along a trunk. Each cluster of leaves was clipped into its own disc, separated from the next by open air. Seen from a distance, the tree seemed to hover in sections rather than grow as a single mass. The work demanded repeated shearing through the growing season, done by eye. A single well-trained specimen might outlast the working life of the gardener who shaped it. Garden bridges were built from stone, timber, or packed earth, and each material set a different mood for the path it carried. A slab of granite laid flat across a stream felt solid, almost geological, barely raised above the water. A timber bridge, arched and railed, drew the eye upward and slowed the step. An earthen bridge, planted with grass along its edges, blurred so completely into the bank that visitors sometimes crossed it without noticing. A single arched bridge, painted deep vermilion or left in plain unfinished wood, crosses many garden ponds in one careful curve. Its rise was calculated so that its reflection, seen from the right angle, completed a full circle in the water below. Craftsmen tested that reflection before setting the final joints. Visitors crossing at the bridge's peak often paused there. The pond spread out on both sides, and the same old geometry repeats across temple and villa gardens alike. Let the body grow heavy now, one part at a time. Begin with the feet and let them sink, as though the mattress had grown deeper beneath them. Let that heaviness climb into the ankles, then the calves, settling like sediment at the bottom of still water. The knees loosen next, then the thighs, until the legs feel too heavy to lift, even if something asked them to. The weight rises into the hips, the low back spreading wide across the bed. Shoulders sink last, pressed down by nothing but their own tiredness, further with every breath that leaves you. Every 8th month, zigzag bridges called yatsuhashi carried visitors across ponds thick with blooming iris. The bridge's broken path forced a slow, deliberate crossing, each turn offering a new angle onto the flowers below. Poets and painters returned to this scene often enough that the zigzag bridge became nearly as recognizable as the iris itself. Some gardens rebuilt these bridges from cypress every few years. The wood wore quickly so close to standing water. Islands built within garden ponds often represented the mythical isles said to hold the secret of immortality, a belief carried over from Chinese Daoist legend. A pond might hold 3 such islands, each reached by a different bridge or left unreachable altogether, visible only from the shore. Pines planted there were trained to lean, as though shaped by decades of sea wind. Though the water around them stayed calm and shallow, the imagined immortals were never depicted. Only the shape of their dwelling remained. Crane and turtle shapes carved into garden stone carried an old promise of long life, borrowed from Chinese legend and reworked in Japanese ponds. A crane took shape from an upright stone, its outline suggesting wings in flight. A turtle formed from a low, flattened rock set with 4 smaller stones for legs. Few visitors noticed both at once. Gardeners placed them apart so the eye discovered one, then later found the other. Restoration work at one Kyoto area garden, generations after its ponds had silted and its stones scattered, revealed an island shaped precisely for a turtle, its headstone missing until workers found it face down in the mud nearby. Records from the estate had called it simply the island, without naming its form. Once the missing stone was set upright again, the turtle's outline became unmistakable. The garden had kept its meaning hidden for decades. By the middle of the Edo period, ordinary townspeople began visiting famous gardens, once reserved for lords and priests. Merchants closed their shops for a day and walked out along dusty roads toward temple grounds, known for their ponds and stone paths. Entry was often free, or cost only a few coins at the gate. Families brought lunch wrapped in cloth. For many, it was their first journey beyond the streets where they worked. Guidebooks printed in Edo listed which gardens deserved a visit in which season, ranking ponds and groves much as a modern traveler ranks distant cities. Woodblock illustrations showed a garden's best bridge or its most famous pine. Some guides mapped entire routes through the city, garden to garden, time to bloom. Copies passed hand to hand until pages softened. A worn guidebook was itself a kind of map of pleasure. Cherry blossoms drew whole crowds into garden grounds each spring, the pink canopy lasting only a week or two before falling. Vendors set up along garden paths, selling tea and sweets to visitors who came simply to sit beneath the trees. Petals drifted onto still ponds until the water itself turned pale pink at the edges. Poets wrote of blossoms falling like snow in warm air. The short season made the sight feel more precious, not less. Autumn turned garden maples deep red and gold, and ponds designed generations earlier for exactly this moment caught the color in their still surface. Visitors walked slow loops around the water, just to see the reflection twice, once in branch and once below. Temple grounds famous for spring blossoms often filled again for this second, later season. Fallen leaves collected along stone edges before staff swept them clear each morning. The same water had held cherry petals only months before. Snow lanterns, called yukimi-doro, were built with wide, flat caps designed to catch snow rather than shed it, so the lantern seemed to wear a small white roof of its own. Some were lit for only a single winter evening, when snowfall was heaviest and the garden nearly empty. Staff sometimes built temporary snow lanterns from packed snow itself, meant to melt away within days. Their disappearance was expected from the start. No one thought to preserve what winter had made. Garden pines were sometimes wrapped in straw rope through the coldest months, a technique called yukitsuri, when ropes fanned outward from a central pole to hold branches against heavy snow. Gardeners climbed each tree in late autumn to tie the ropes by hand, working from the top branch downward. The rope pattern itself became a kind of winter ornament, conical and precise against bare gray sky. Removing the ropes took just as long each spring. The trees stood bare of decoration the rest of the year. Far off, past whatever walls surround you now, some faint sound rises and falls in its own rhythm. Perhaps a draft moving through an old house, perhaps something with no name at all. It swells for a moment, then pulls back before you can place it. No need to follow it. Let your breath ease each time the sound fades. A little longer, a little slower than before. The sound keeps its own slow tide, arriving and receding, and you can simply rest inside its coming and going, letting each wave carry you further down. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry's ships anchored off the coast near Edo, ending over 2 centuries of Japan's limited contact with the outside world. Word of the black ships spread quickly through nearby towns, carried by fishermen and coastal watchmen. Garden life continued much as before, but the political order that had protected it for so long was beginning to shift. Foreign visitors would soon walk temple grounds once closed to them. The old bridges and ponds remained, waiting for new eyes. Modernization swept through Japan at remarkable speed after Perry's ships departed. Railways and telegraph lines replacing old post roads within a generation. Court gardens once tended by hereditary staff lost their funding as the old government dissolved. Weeds crept across paths that had been swept daily for centuries. Some ponds silted over, unnoticed for years. Attention had turned toward factories, ports, and foreign fashions. Feudal lords lost both title and income once the old domain system ended, and many could no longer maintain the grounds their families had shaped for generations. Some daimyo gardens were sold to merchants, others simply left to nature's slow reclaiming. A few great ponds were drained for farmland or building lots. Stone lanterns were carted off and resold. What had taken decades to design vanished within a single season of neglect. Ogawa Jihei, a gardener working in Kyoto, found new patrons among the merchants and industrialists rising in the changed economy. He studied old temple grounds closely, then adapted their lessons for clients who wanted something quieter than daimyo grandeur. His designs favored open lawns beside traditional stonework, a blending few gardeners of earlier centuries would have attempted. Wealthy families across the city sought his skill. His name became attached to gardens still admired today. Muranan, a garden built beside Kyoto's canal, shows this blending clearly. Lawn spreads where moss might once have covered the ground, letting sunlight fall in ways older gardens rarely allowed. A stream still winds past borrowed mountain scenery in the old manor. Its designer paired new materials with centuries, old principles of framed view and hidden path. Visitors today still walk its lawn toward that same distant hill. Beyond Japan's shores, curiosity about the country's culture drew crowds to exhibitions abroad. Organizers at World's Fairs in Europe and America began building full-scale Japanese gardens as showcase attractions. Carpenters and gardeners traveled from Japan to construct these display grounds by hand. Ponds, bridges, and pruned pines rose temporarily on fairgrounds meant for a single season. Millions of visitors walked through gardens, unlike anything built in their own countries. For most fairgoers, raked gravel was an entirely new sight. Some assumed the pale stone was meant to represent snow. Others guessed at sand from a distant shore. Guides explained the pattern stood for water, rippling outward from unseen rocks. Few visitors had ever seen gravel treated as art, rather than mere paving. Photographs of these dry gardens circulated afterward in foreign newspapers, carrying the image further than the fair itself ever traveled. London's Battersea Park welcomed a permanent Japanese garden built within its grounds, one of the earliest such gardens intended to remain rather than be dismantled after a season. Local laborers worked alongside visiting craftsmen to shape its pond and stone paths. Fog and cold posed challenges no Kyoto garden had faced. Plants were chosen for hardiness against a climate far removed from their origin. The garden opened its gates to Londoners strolling on ordinary weekday afternoons. Across the ocean, wealthy American families began commissioning private gardens, modeled on what they had admired at the fairs. Estates in California, New York, and elsewhere added ponds crossed by curved wooden bridges. Hired gardeners, some trained in Japan, oversaw the placement of every stone. Owners often had little interest in the philosophy behind the design, only its appearance. Even so, the gardens took root and, in time, matured much like their originals. Decades later, a stone lantern standing in a private California garden drew the attention of a visiting scholar who noticed carving marks unlike anything made locally. Records eventually traced the lantern back to a temple workshop near Kyoto, where it had been carved before being shipped abroad for an early estate commission. The paper trails survived in shipping manifests kept by the importing company. Its new owners had never known its exact origin. The lantern had simply been admired for its shape. Let the warmth begin low, somewhere near the backs of your knees, and let it climb from there without hurry. Feel it rise past your thighs, spreading wide and low, like light filling a room from the floor up. It reaches your hips, your stomach, loosening whatever held tight through the day. Let it climb your spine, one small stretch at a time. By the time it reaches your shoulders, you may already be half asleep, and that is exactly where you're meant to be. Portland's Hillside Garden opened in the early 1960s, years after the war between Japan and the United States had ended. City leaders in Oregon invited a landscape professor from Kyoto to shape ground above the Willamette River. He laid out ponds, a dry garden, and a path that climbed through the hills. The project was framed as a gesture of friendship between former enemies. Cherry trees lined the entrance walk. Few visitors asked why. San Francisco's tea garden began as a display built for a World's Fair in 1894, tucked into a corner of Golden Gate Park. Most fair structures came down within months. This one stayed. A wooden gate, a drum bridge, and a small pagoda remained standing after the crowds went home. A Japanese family lived on the grounds for years, tending the plantings and pouring tea for visitors. The bridge still arches too steeply for comfort, exactly as it always did. Kyoto craftsmen still cut granite lanterns by hand, in workshops little changed from centuries past. Blocks arrive from quarries outside the city, rough and gray. A carver marks the shape in charcoal. Then chisel and mallet work for weeks. No machine touches the stone's face. Apprentices learn by watching an older hand's rhythm before ever lifting a tool themselves. The finished lantern keeps proportions used since tea masters first asked for one. Bonsai, a related art, shapes miniature trees within shallow trays of soil. A pine no taller than a forearm can carry the shape of a mountain giant. Wire bends young branches into curves that mimic decades of wind. Roots are trimmed each spring to keep the tree small without weakening it. The tray is chosen with as much care as the tree itself, glazed or bare to suit the season. It looks impossibly old. Garden design and bonsai share a taste for implied age, a wish to make young things look as though time had already worked on them. A newly built dry garden can be raked to resemble centuries of weathering. A young pine can be trained to lean like one bent by 100 winters. Neither hurries growth. Both arts borrow the look of duration rather than waiting for it outright. A garden's designer and a bonsai grower once studied from the same old manuals. A single bonsai pine can outlive several human generations, passed from one caretaker to the next, like an heirloom. Some trees kept in Japanese nurseries today were already old when their current owners were born. Ownership changes, the tree's care does not. Watering, wiring, and repotting follow schedules written down and handed on with the pot. A tree's age is sometimes measured not in rings, but in the number of families who have tended it. The oldest specimens are watched over like family members who happen to be plants. Suizuki, the art of stone appreciation, treats a single rock as a landscape in miniature. A stone no larger than a loaf of bread might suggest a mountain range, a waterfall, or a lone island. Collectors search riverbeds and shorelines for stones whose shape needs no carving at all. Each stone rests on a carved wooden stand fitted to its exact contours. A tray of raked sand beneath it can stand in for an entire sea. The stone is admired, not altered. Moss gardens require decades of undisturbed shade before their surfaces settle into that deep, even green visitors admire. Sunlight and foot traffic both work against them, drying patches or wearing them thin. A moss garden begun today will not look finished within any one gardener's working life. Trees are chosen and placed first. Their canopy is calculated to filter light just enough. Only after that shade matures does the moss below begin to spread on its own. Some of the most admired moss gardens survive only through daily watering carried out by hand. Dawn watering never stops. Gardeners walk the grounds with cans, checking patches that dry fast in sun and misting those that stay too damp. A single dry week in summer can undo growth built over years. Staff at well-known temple gardens have kept this watch for generations, often before any gate opens to visitors. The moss looks wild, though it is closely managed. Air pollution threatens delicate moss in modern city gardens, a problem no high-end era designer could have imagined. Cities change the air. Fine dust and acid rain settle onto moss faster than gardeners can wash it away. Some urban temple gardens have installed windbreaks to slow exhaust drift from nearby streets. Species once common in old records now struggle where they thrived for centuries. Head gardeners watch weather reports the way farmers once watched the sky. Dust drifts in a shaft of window light, in no hurry to settle. Somewhere behind these walls, an old clock keeps its slow count, unbothered by the hour. Let your shoulders drop an inch, then another, as if gravity had just remembered you. Nothing asks for your attention now. The dust keeps drifting. Let your eyes close along with it, and let the room dim the way afternoon light dims, without anyone noticing the moment it happens. Bombing during the war's final years reaches close to several historic gardens across Japan. Okayama's strolling garden, built centuries earlier by a feudal lord, is struck and largely destroyed in an air raid. Its ponds survive, though its structures do not. Records from the city describe rebuilding efforts starting within a decade. Other gardens nearby lose trees, walls, and tea houses to the same campaign. The stone lanterns, heavier and harder to burn, often remain standing among the ash. Kyoto itself is spared the heaviest bombing of the war's last months. Ryoanji's dry garden, with its raked gravel and 15 stones, sits untouched through those years. No shrapnel falls across its walls. Monks continue raking its gravel much as they always had. The temple's quiet, in this one sense, holds. Its survival owes less to protection than to decisions made far from the garden itself, in rooms none of its caretakers ever saw. Restoration crews after the war turned to gardens left ragged by neglect, fire, and years without proper hands. Fences lean, ponds silt over where no one dredged them. Teams work slowly, sometimes using pre-war photographs to guide where a stone or bridge once stood. Funding is thin in those years. Progress is measured in single trees replanted, single paths cleared. Some gardens take a generation to look whole again. Diaries kept by temple staff during the war mention gardeners still tending grounds through air raids, moving between shelters and the beds they were responsible for. One entry, later published, notes pruning continuing even as sirens sounded nearby. These pages survived in temple archives, tucked among ledgers no one thought urgent at the time. Historians reading them decades later found routine work recorded beside the war itself, written in the same steady hand. Architects in the decades following the war begin studying Japanese gardens for lessons in restraint. What is left out, they note, often matters as much as what is placed. Empty gravel, an unplanted corner, a wall with nothing painted on it, all carry weight in this tradition. Design schools abroad start including Japanese garden theory in their courses. Students are asked to draw what a space omits, not only what it contains. Ma, a word meaning something closer to meaningful emptiness than simple absence, comes to define much of how these gardens are read. A pause between stones counts as part of the design. A stretch of bare moss carries as much intention as a planted tree. Writers on Japanese aesthetics borrow the term to explain silence in music and blank space in painting as well. In gardens, it began as something felt long before it was named. Western designers, visiting or reading about these grounds, borrow one idea more than any other: the framed view. A garden gate is cut to hold a single tree inside its opening. A window is set low, catching only one stone, one branch, nothing more. Parks and private gardens abroad begin including such openings, sometimes without any other Japanese element at all. The frame alone travels well across distance and language. Garden societies form abroad through the later 20th century, gathering enthusiasts, retired diplomats, and trained horticulturists under one aim: preserving craft knowledge across an ocean from where it began. Members exchange letters, then newsletters, then photographs of pruning techniques attempted on unfamiliar trees. Some societies fund apprenticeships, sending members to Kyoto for a season of hands-on training. Meetings are often held in borrowed rooms, folding chairs arranged around slide projectors and tea. In Kyoto, A gardener may spend years sweeping paths and hauling stone before being allowed near a temple garden's actual design. Apprentices start with the humblest tasks, raking gravel under a master's eye, learning which broom suits which surface. Only after seasons of this groundwork are they trusted with shears near an old pine. The training has no fixed length written anywhere. It ends when the master judges the hands ready, not before. A gardener's shears are chosen the way a carpenter might choose a favorite chisel, tested for weight and balance before purchase. Blacksmiths in certain towns still forge them by hand, folding steel the way swordsmiths once did. A pair might cost a season's wages. Owners wipe the blades after each use and oil the pivot before storing them, wrapped in cloth. Some shears outlast the gardener who first carried them, passed to an apprentice with the handle already worn smooth. Let your eyes rest now, even if they are already closed. Feel the small muscles around them loosen, the way a hand slowly opens after holding something too long. There is no need to hold your face in any particular shape. Let the jaw hang loose, the lips barely touching, the whole face turning heavy and still, like a mask set down after a long evening. Behind your closed eyes, the dark grows soft at the edges, thickening, deepening, asking nothing of you at all. Rot placement in these gardens has rarely been taught from a page. A master walks the ground with an apprentice, pointing at a boulder, then at the space beside it, saying little else. The apprentice watches where the weight seems to settle, how a stone's face turns toward or away from a path. Years pass this way, lesson folded into lesson, until judgment arrives without a rule ever being written down. The eye learns what the hand could never explain. Sound in a garden stream is shaped as carefully as its banks. A narrow channel forces water into a quicker, brighter note, while a wider bed slows it to a low murmur. Gardeners test different stone placements, listening from a nearby veranda before deciding where a rock should sit beneath the flow. A single boulder angled just so can turn plain water into something closer to music. The channel is dug, then redug, until the sound satisfies an ear no one else may notice. Bamboo deer scarers called shishiodoshi work by a simple trick of balance. Water fills a hollow bamboo tube until it tips, empties, and swings back to strike a stone with a sharp, hollow click. The sound was meant to startle deer and wild boar away from tender shoots. Over centuries, the click became less a deterrent and more a marker of passing time, one knock following another through a still afternoon. Visitors now wait for it the way one waits for a clock to chime. Beneath certain gardens, hidden below the soil, a ceramic jar catches falling water drop by drop. Called the suikinkutsu, it turns an ordinary drip into a resonant chime, the sound rising faintly through a narrow opening near a stone basin. Guests washing their hands before a tea ceremony sometimes pause, uncertain where the low ringing comes from. The jar itself lies buried and unseen, doing its quiet work underground for decades without ever needing to be dug up or repaired. Stone lanterns are rarely placed to throw light directly onto a path. Instead, they are set so their glow falls across moss or catches the underside of a maple branch, leaving the walkway itself half in shadow. A lantern near a pond might illuminate only the water's edge, letting darkness hold the rest. Visitors are meant to feel their way partly by memory, partly by the little light given. The shadow, gardeners say, does as much work as the flame. Some gardens choose the opposite approach entirely, keeping only a single trickling stream for sound. No clicking bamboo, no hidden jar, nothing but water finding its way over a few stones toward a pond. Designers who favor this restraint argue that too many sounds compete, dulling each other rather than adding depth. In such a garden, the stream carries the whole weight of quiet, its faint murmur the only sign that anything at all is moving. Walls of clay topped with roof tile line many garden borders, low enough to see over from within. They mark ownership without shutting out the world beyond. A distant hillside or a neighboring pine might be deliberately left visible above the wall's edge, borrowed into the garden's view as if it belonged there all along. Rain darkens the clay unevenly over the years, leaving pale patches where the tile has sheltered it longest. The wall frames rather than encloses. A garden gate is often placed slightly off the line. A visitor expects, angled a few steps from where the main path would carry them straight through. This small shift forces a pause, a turn of the body, a moment of attention right at the threshold. Some designers explain it as a way of separating the ordinary world from the garden beyond. Others simply learned it from watching how guests moved and built the gate to match. The path bends, and the visitor bends with it. Stepping stones through many gardens are laid unevenly on purpose, some raised, some sunk, some tilted just enough to ask for attention. A visitor cannot cross them quickly without looking down. This forces the eyes to the ground, then, at a gap or a wider stone, releases them upward to a view the gardener chose to reveal at exactly that pace. Speed is not possible on stones like these. The uneven path decides how fast a person is allowed to arrive. Footsteps on raked gravel produce a particular crunch, dry and even, and gardeners have long treated that sound as part of a garden's design. A visitor's approach can be heard before it is seen, giving those already seated near a tea house a small warning, a moment to settle before company arrives. Some paths use finer gravel near quiet rooms, coarser near open courtyards, changing the very sound of arrival by section. The ear is led just as carefully as the eye. Let the exhale grow just a little longer than it was a moment ago, without forcing anything. Notice the small pause that follows each breath, that brief stillness before the next one begins on its own. There is no need to count them, only to let each one arrive and leave in its own time. Somewhere in the chest, the rhythm settles into something slower than thought. Let it carry you now, breath after breath, further from waking. A tea house window is sometimes cut low, close to the floor mats, so that a seated guest sees only one stone framed within it, nothing more. The rest of the garden disappears behind the wall. This narrowing of view was thought to sharpen attention, letting a single mossy rock stand in for the whole world outside. Light through the small opening shifts slowly across the afternoon, changing the stone without ever changing the frame. Guests were meant to notice that. Trees for a garden were often chosen with a weight of decades already built into the plan. A maple planted small might not reach its intended color and shape for 30 years, long after the gardener who placed it had died. Pines were positioned with an eye toward how their branches would spread once fully grown, not how they looked freshly planted. Gardens made this way belonged less to their makers than to the people who would later tend them. Certain gardens hold a view that exists in its complete form for only a single week each year. An iris pond may bloom fully for 7 or 8 days before the flowers fade, leaving the rest of the season as approach and memory. Gardeners plan whole paths and bridges around that brief window, knowing most visitors will see only the buds or the last petals. The finest sight in the garden was never meant to last. A planting ledger kept at one Kyoto temple recorded which saplings were set into the ground, and, beside each entry, a note on how many years would pass before that tree matched the height its planners intended. Later records showed the trees had been chosen not for the abbot then serving, but for the one expected to hold that position decades on. The ledger survived a series of storage house repairs, tucked among tax papers rather than garden records, where fire and flood had spared it by accident. Designers working today still turn to the 11th century manual sakutaiki when placing a single stone or shaping a pond's edge. Its instructions on following the natural lean of a rock rather than forcing it upright appear in modern training texts almost unchanged. Landscape architects in cities far from Kyoto have translated its passages into new languages, adapting old advice to gardens with concrete walls and steel fences. The book's age has not made it obsolete. Gardeners still read it before they dig. Several historic Japanese gardens now carry recognition from the United Nations Cultural Agency, marking them as sites of value to the whole world rather than to one city or one nation alone. The designation brought funding for careful maintenance and limits on nearby development. Temple grounds that once served a single sect's quiet devotions now appear on lists beside cathedrals and ancient ruins from other continents entirely. The stones did not change, only the scale of who now claims to protect them did. Temple gardens across Kyoto now welcome travelers arriving from every direction, speaking languages the original monks could never have imagined hearing on those paths. Guidebooks in dozens of scripts describe the same stepping stones once meant to slow a single visitor's pace. Buses idle near gates built for quiet arrivals on foot, yet inside the walls the moss still grows at its own rate, and the raked gravel still holds its lines each morning, indifferent to how many footsteps crossed it the day before. Glass plate photographs taken in the 1880s show garden paths that no longer follow the same course today. One image from a Kyoto temple reveals a pine since removed after storm damage, its shape recorded only in silver and gelatin. Another shows a pond edge later widened during repairs. Historians comparing these plates to present grounds have mapped exactly what time and weather quietly rearranged. Painted screens and hand-drawn diagrams have guided the rebuilding of gardens lost to time. Restoration teams study folding screens depicting a lord's estate, cross-referencing brushwork with surviving foundation stones. Diagrams once kept for tax assessment show pond shapes no map had otherwise preserved. Where no drawing survives, workers have sometimes left a section unplanted rather than guessed. Fire has claimed several gardens across the centuries, and some have returned stone by stone afterward. Craftsmen numbered each surviving rock before clearing debris, then set them back according to old sketches and memory. A bridge rebuilt this way sometimes uses timber cut to match the original span exactly. The garden that reappears is not the same wood or stone, yet it holds the same arrangement it always did. Let the heaviness begin in your hands tonight, resting wherever they happen to lie. Feel the small bones settle, one against another, as though they had finally been set down after carrying something all day. That heaviness spreads up through the wrists, unhurried, filling the forearms the way water fills a low place in the ground. Let it reach the shoulders next, and let the shoulders simply agree to it. There is no need to hold anything up right now. Hotel builders in modern Japan have commissioned garden designers trained in temple traditions centuries old. A courtyard behind a glass lobby might follow the same proportions once used for a monastery's dry garden. Stone lanterns sourced from old quarries stand beside sliding doors and elevator banks. Guests passing through on business trips step for a moment into a layout planned generations before travel by air existed at all. Botanical gardens on nearly every continent now include a section built in the Japanese style. A pond, a stone path, a carefully pruned pine mark these plots apart from the surrounding collections of foreign flora. Visitors in cold northern cities walk beneath maples, chosen to turn red on schedule each autumn. The layouts vary in size and skill, yet each one borrows the same quiet grammar of stone and water first written down long ago. A garden in Buenos Aires follows a strolling path modeled on grounds once walked in Kyoto. Its designers studied historic pond gardens before laying the first stone, matching the turns that once revealed new views at each bend. Local plants stand in for species that could not survive the climate, chosen for similar shape and color instead. The path still bends the same way, guiding visitors toward a view withheld until the final turn. Seattle's Japanese garden opened under the direction of a landscaper trained in Kyoto before he crossed the ocean to design it. He arranged its pond and pathways using principles carried in memory rather than blueprint. Maples he selected have since grown far taller than the plantings around them, their canopies now shaping views he first sketched decades earlier. The garden he built still follows his original lines, tended long after his own working years ended. Public gardens abroad have begun training their own staff in the pruning methods once passed only within Kyoto guilds. Groundskeepers in cities far from Japan now learn to shape pine branches into layered clouds by hand, guided by visiting craftsmen for weeks at a time. Some travel to Kyoto itself for training before returning to their home gardens. The shears they carry are chosen with the same care once reserved for temple tools. An immigration ledger kept at a Pacific port names one of the earliest Japanese gardeners hired to work abroad. His trade listed plainly beside his age and the ship that carried him. The entry gave no detail of his training, only his occupation and his destination, a private estate seeking someone who understood stone and pine. Later correspondence from that estate described gardens shaped exactly as he had planned them. The ledger survived in a county archive, its ink faded but its columns still legible. Digital archives now hold centuries of Japanese garden history within searchable records. Museums and universities have scanned old scrolls, survey maps, and photographs into databases anyone can browse. A researcher in another country can compare a temple's current layout against drawings made generations ago. Screens now hold what paper once carried alone, though the paper is kept too. Historians still argue over how many gardens from the Heian period survive in any original form. Fire, flood, and centuries of rebuilding have altered nearly every pond and path from that era. What remains is often a later reconstruction laid over older foundations, stone upon stone across time. No consensus has ever been reached on which grounds, if any, are truly unchanged. Little physical trace remains of the ponds once described so carefully in the tale of Genji. The mansions that held them were built of wood and paper, structures never meant to last 1,000 years. Their gardens vanished with them, leaving only the poem and the prose behind. What readers picture today comes from ink, not from any stone that still stands. A handful of stones believed to come from ancient garden sites now rest in museum cases far from where they were placed. Archaeologists recovered them from excavated foundations, their original arrangements long lost to time. Curators display them with careful labels noting only probable origin and rough age. Visitors pause before them, unaware how far each stone once traveled before it settled here. Somewhere beyond this room, a distant hum rises for a moment, then fades into nothing, the way a passing car dissolves into silence down a street you cannot see. Let that fading stand in for anything unfinished in your mind tonight. Let it rise and let it go, without needing to know where it came from. Your shoulders can drop an inch further now, the way a held door finally swings shut on its own. Certain garden techniques have never been written down at all, passed only through years of watching a master's hands. A young worker learns to feel when a branch has been cut too far, or when a stone sits wrong in its bed, long before words could explain why. These lessons live only between one pair of hands and the next. Some skills, it seems, refuse to survive on paper. The particular rock, the Sakutiki, once described in detail, may no longer exist at all. Centuries of rebuilding, erosion, and lost records make it impossible to point to any single stone and call it the same one. Scholars have searched old temple grounds for a match without certainty. The words remain, precise and vivid, describing a stone that time may have already carried away. New gardens rise every year, still shaped by principles set down in that same old manual. Landscapers in Kyoto and beyond study its guidance on stone placement, water flow, and borrowed scenery before laying out a single path. A garden finished this spring may follow instructions written for a garden 900 years gone. The old advice keeps proving itself, one fresh plot of earth at a time. A young apprentice today learns to rake gravel the same way monks once did, drawing long lines with a wooden tool from memory rather than measurement. Instructors correct the angle of the wrist before the pattern itself. Hours pass before a single courtyard is finished to a teacher's satisfaction. The motion has not changed in longer than anyone can date with certainty. The moss at Saihoji still spreads across the ground the way it did centuries ago, tended by hands that never let it dry out. Its caretakers water it by watch and by feel, adjusting for shade, season, and rainfall no calendar can predict. Visitors walk raised paths above it now, kept just far enough away to leave it undisturbed. The green carpet beneath their feet has outlasted every gardener who has ever cared for it. Moonlight settles over garden ponds, much as it always has. A pond shaped for Heian courtiers still holds that same pale light on clear nights. No modern engineer redesigned the way still water catches the moon. The reflection has not changed. Someone standing on a wooden veranda tonight sees nearly what a poet once saw, long before cameras or electric lamps existed anywhere in the world. Cherry trees planted generations ago keep blooming every spring. Some in Kyoto's older gardens trace their line back through grafts and cuttings spanning centuries. The blossoms do not last. They open for a week, then scatter across the pond below, just as they did for viewers long since gone. The tree remains. New petals fall on old branches, season after season, indifferent to who happens to be watching. Stones set into a garden centuries ago have rarely shifted since. A gardener chose each one for balance, then buried its base deep enough to hold through storms and seasons. Moss now covers edges once left bare and sharp. The stone stays. Whatever else in the garden has been replanted, rerouted, or rebuilt, these old placements have often survived untouched, exactly where a single pair of hands once set them. Gardens continue their slow work regardless of who happens to be watching them. Moss keeps spreading whether or not a visitor walks the path that morning. Water keeps moving through stone channels on days when the temple gates stay locked. The garden simply proceeds. One season folds into the next, unnoticed by anyone, until the gates open again and someone finally happens to look. People walking a garden path today often pause at the same bend where visitors stopped centuries before. The view was arranged that way long before any of them were born. A stone bridge, a framed glimpse of water, a single old pine, still call for the same stillness they always did. We have walked a long road tonight, from rice fields and rock circles to raked gravel, and moss kept alive by patient hands. The moon above your window is the same moon that once lit those old ponds. Rest now, the way a garden rests between one visitor and the next. Good night.